You're listening to Mics and Sirens, the official podcast of the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in Western Australia. DFES acknowledges the traditional owners on the land of which this podcast is created, the Whadjuk people.
I remember it saying to a colleague before I left, look, I'm not that worried. There's only 2 metres of water in the Fitzroy. You know, once we got past 12.5 metres and it just kept going and going and going, that's when we had the inundation. Literally, there was metres of mud. And I could see the tennis court and the fence around the tennis court. And the water had gone over the fence level of the tennis court. This is different than my previous exposure. This is the next level because we actually have people at risk. I was fearful that we would lose lives.
December 28, 2022. Tropical Cyclone Ellie crossed over the coast of Western Australia and dumped around 500 millilitres of rain in less than a week. River levels in the Kimberley town of Fitzroy Crossing got to almost 16 metres high. That's nearly 10 average-sized household swimming pools stacked on top of each other. More than 200 homes were damaged, several roads and highways too, and remote communities were left isolated. The destruction was widespread, and one of the people leading the response was District Officer Glenn Hall. Glenn led an incident management team of about 70 people each day, coordinating emergency response efforts to make sure people were out of harm's way. How does someone lead a 1-in-100-year flooding disaster? Where do you even begin? I'll let Glenn tell you himself. Glenn, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with January 2023, when the aftermath of Tropical Cyclone Ellie very quickly became the worst flooding disaster in Western Australian history. You became the incident controller, or the IC. Do you remember what was going through your mind when you were put in charge of this record-breaking incident?
So I was deployed as a Level 3 Natural Hazards Incident Controller, with the potential that there could be the tropical low after the impact of Ellie, and it traversed across the region. And it's a situation that was seen a lot of times in the Kimberley, where we'd had tropical lows travel across the Kimberley and have the resultant cause of flooding, which would bring isolation issues and the like. So, and I was deployed with a small team. I had a planning officer, a management support officer, and we flew up. And I remember talking to the planning officer, giving him some idea of structure and how I'd fit into the work that had already been done in the Kimberley, and the work that had been done by the staff up there in regards to preparedness, which is just normal activity which you'd expect for something like this. So headed in, and then we had a night shift as well. And so those days that started, and in my head as I flew up there, and I'd been I was the district officer for Central Kimberley, so I knew that area. That really benefited and helped me. And I'd been to a few events in Fitzroy Crossing. The 2016 event was notable, where it got to 12.16 metres at the bridge. So it was just underneath or touched the asphalt of the bridge. And all that really brought was, we had cut off at Plum Plain, we had cut off at 2 Mile and Blue Bush, and we had the resultant isolation. What we didn't have was that, inundation of homes and the effect of impact of homes. So in my mind, that was the picture I was painting in my head. So
you thought, I've been down this road before, it's going to be like any incident I've led before.
Exactly. So, and if you look at the track that the system took, and it did this loop, and it looped around the Fitzroy Valley as it moved, and so it was fairly stationary. And so, that was always the thing with those tropical lows, the fast-moving tropical lows, great, because they don't have the opportunity to drop a lot of rain, whereas the slow-moving systems drop the rain and cause the flooding. But this did a loop to the point where we were we had the rain, and then the rain was impacting Broome as well, and we had another incident management team, or supplementing the incident management team that were coming up, and they're bringing up into C-130, so we had ADF assistance, and they couldn't even get into Broome because of the rain. So this system just did this loop, and I remember it saying to a colleague before I left, look, I'm not that worried. There's only 2 metres of water in the Fitzroy. It's got, ability, and thank God there was, but there's only 2 metres in the Fitzroy at the moment at Fitzroy Crossing. So it's got the ability to take up a lot of water. Then we saw the levels that we got. So it was this event in my head bearing in mind I'm based in Broome, running the incident management team out of Broome. I had an operations cell operating out of Fitzroy Crossing. Very capable people, both volunteers and staff over there. And then it got to the point where it just grew and grew. So for the first, and it's unusual, I did think I did 13 shifts. Chief Superintendent Pipe came up as the operations area manager. I think he was a day after me, but we were it. For those basically first 2 weeks, running the job.
So you saw it at 2 metres. What levels were you seeing in previous incidents, just to compare?
Yeah, so I remember doing a floodboat course in Fitzroy Crossing, and we had lunch right at the intersection of the Margaret River and the Fitzroy River, and we had lunch on the bank of the river. 3 weeks later, there was 11 metres of water over that exact point. So the river's got an ability to take on this huge volume of water. I think it's the second highest flowing river in outflow at flood after the Amazon. So, once the Fitzroy is in flood, it's the second highest outflowing river in the world. So it just gives you an idea of the capacity that it can take. Knowing that it had that ability, 10, 11 metres, 12 metres, brings the isolation issues. So it's fuel into the towns and food into the towns and the outlying Aboriginal communities and the outlying pastoral stations that are impacted by that as well. And I remember going into Fitzroy Crossing for the 2016 event, and Superintendent Pipe at the time gave me the use of a helicopter, and I worked with the volunteers there. We only were a small team, but our main role in that helicopter was reconnaissance, resupply, and medical evacuation. There were 3 tasks. That's why we had the helicopter. But we were able to cope based on that level of flooding, and because it didn't bring in that inundation. But once it got past that, once we got past 12.5 metres and it just kept going and going and going, that's when we had the inundation.
Did you ever anticipate it would become as catastrophic as it was?
No. I'm brutally honest. And I know we've got a plan for eventualities. But no, not at that stage. Benefit of hindsight now, but at the time, no.
What was the moment when you started to think, okay, this is bigger than I could ever have imagined?
Yeah, look, the concern, obviously, we work to the strategic control priorities, and, that first control priority is the protection of life. And when we were conducting rescues, when we had the flood boats, pushing up against, and the volunteer, I cannot commend the volunteers enough for the work they did. The Fitzroy Crossing Volunteer Fire and Emergency Service, the work that they did in those initial days, they had the flood boat, and thank God they do have one, and they were conducting those rescues. We were, mobilising the heavy lift rescue rotary wings out of Broome, and just to perform rescues, or the potential to perform rescues as well. So when we got to that point, and this is different than my previous exposure. This is the next level, because we actually have people at risk, and and I'll be honest, there was times there, because I'm so far away, the team's so far away, and we've only got limited resources in at Fitzroy Crossing. I was fearful that we would lose lives, and thank the heavens that it didn't get to that stage.
Can you paint a picture of the devastation that you witnessed?
Yeah.
What does flood damage look like? You obviously, after a bushfire, you go and you see the wreck, you see charred remains, you see twisted metal and all these sorts of things that people can picture. But flood damage is a little bit different. What does that look like? Yeah,
so initially working out of Broome, and it wasn't till must have been a good 2 weeks that I was that I went in, and I went in with the Deputy Commissioner, with Mr. Waters, and got to witness it for myself. So I was relying on the intelligence from a team, what I was seeing on social media, on the media, and the reports from operations in regards to it. But going into and seeing, literally there was metres of mud. And bearing in mind, these homes in those outlying communities from Fitzroy Crossing, they're built up. So there, it is on a floodplain, and it has happened before. But seeing that and seeing the lodge and the tennis court. I remember seeing when we flew in and landed, and I could see the tennis court and the fence around the tennis court. And the water had gone over the fence level of the tennis court, and you could tell. So it was definitely widespread. It didn't get into. It certainly impacted the very outskirts of Fitzroy Crossing, the town, and there was certainly some damage to homes, within Fitzroy Crossing and the outskirts there. But it didn't go right through the middle of the town. It was those outlying, the communities directly adjacent to Fitzroy Crossing is where it had the biggest impact.
How big was the team that you led?
At its height, it grew from. Again, working with the team from the Kimberley and the Regional Operations Centre crew that were there. I had a crew of 5 to 6, and that grew at its height was around 70.
And so where were you all based? So is everybody, can you paint a picture of that scene?
Yeah.
Are you all in an office? Are you all kind of crammed in a little shipping container, or what's that?
So, and there have been some great advancements in that, and DFES have just, initiated that type of program where they, the mobile EOCs emergency operations centres that we mobilise. But we're working out of the Broome Regional Office. So it's not huge. It's the ex-Customs House. DFES have had it for a long time. But literally there were, I remember having a conversation early on, do we branch out to, do we go to the bushfire station? Do we go, well, it's better to keep everyone in-house. And there were disadvantages and advantages. And look, at the end of the day, we branched out to the convention centre next door. We'd run our incident management team meetings next door. And we made it work.
Is there a lot of hustle and bustle?
Yeah.
What's the vibe in there?
Yeah, definitely. And throw COVID in the middle. Okay, so COVID was there, and we had to, try and buy best we can. And thank God we didn't have an outbreak. But police, people coming in and out, and the best we could do. And I remember we had a safety officer who was pretty rigid on those requirements in the early days. But it literally got to the point where, and we did, and it worked really well. We embedded. Where we'd have normally an incident support group meeting, you'd have all your stakeholders, your government agencies and your non-government organisations, and you'd deal with them off to the side. So you'd have your incident management team meeting, and then you'd have your ISG separate. We combined, and we brought in communities, we brought in WA Country Health, and we embedded them in with us because we had to. The work requirement really meant that we needed on. Decisions need to be made on the spot. So WACS could...
So you needed people face to face.
Yeah. And so that brought great benefits because as things were happening, we could make the required changes and we could talk to people face to face, and it really helped. But in the end, what it meant was, I can remember there were 2 people in the photocopier room and they had the headphones on and they were trying to do a Teams meeting. And then I look directly adjacent and there's the training room and there's people sitting on plastic buckets doing the same thing because they're talking to their organisations. So they're having a Teams meeting with their organisation to say, well, look, this is happening.
So their seats were plastic buckets,
absolutely,
basically. You have to be innovative.
Yeah. And, there's good and bad things, I suppose, from that. But it just goes to show when the chips are down and you have to perform, people performed.
Not all heroes wear medals, but many do. Do you know any fire and emergency services personnel worthy of an Australian Fire Service Medal, Emergency Services Medal or Australian Bravery decorations? Say thank you to those who make a difference, serve others and run towards the danger to protect us all. Nominate someone for national recognition at the highest level. Visit the DFES website, dfes.wa.gov.au to find out more now.
You're listening to Mics and Sirens. I'm Silvana Politano and I'm here with Glenn Hall, one of DFES's incident controllers during the Kimberley floods that impacted the Fitzroy Valley in Western Australia. Is it difficult with such a large-scale incident? Obviously, the priorities of the day are the first thing that you're thinking about. Is it difficult to think too far ahead in those situations because there's such an abundance of work to do in the, each moment?
that trust thing that I was talking about, if I can rely on my functional heads, there were times there when right now I need to set time aside because where am I going with this? What is what's it going to look like in a week's time? Because I knew we were going to be there for a long time. What's it going to look like in 2 weeks' time? What do I need to be doing? So that was the thought process. And I can remember a conversation I had with the commissioner, and out of the now we have, I wouldn't have that same conversation now because now we've got an SOP in regards to how to manage flood-affected structures. But there was this real crossover piece in regards to what's response and what's recovery, and remembering that the Kimberley, it's not the metropolitan area, so there's not the level of resourcing that there is in the metro area that there is in the Kimberley. So there was this definite crossover of how we could assist the locals to recover from the impact of this incident, and hopefully we, I'm sure we had our struggles along the way, but hopefully we got to meet that, and the recovery process is still occurring to this day.
What was the biggest challenge you found with running this incident?
Dealing and making sure that we were meeting the needs of the community. Initially, I am going to say the Aboriginal communities and the intricacies that and the cultural considerations we need to make sure that we're dealing with those Indigenous communities, so that we're getting the best for them and treating them with the respect. And also the rest of the community, we cannot forget the pastoral stations, cannot forget the teachers in Campbell and all the rest of it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was making sure that we were trying to meet the needs of the community and determine what they were, and then respond to those needs accordingly.
What were members of the community like? Did you spend time with them? Did you speak to them? What were they saying? What were their thoughts?
Yeah, look, I empathise with some of the things, especially those people that had to evacuate and were put into very trying. It was challenging in regards to the evac centre wasn't perfect. It was hot, it was humid, etc., and the conditions that they were faced. But all in all, people in that part of the world are resilient.
There were a number of Aboriginal communities, small communities, that were left isolated. What was the impact on them?
Yeah, their impact to their homes, and I know that there's been some challenges in regards to, and that we've met those from a recovery perspective, those challenges, but it was that water through the homes, and then the resultant issues that come from that. So, we may have been able to wash out the mud. The responders there had some challenging circumstances in regards to doing that and washing out, cleaning out. And then there's everything, the impact, the sewage impact, the ongoing health impacts because, low-lying water, and we all know the mosquito-borne viruses and that are around the area. And then the process to make sure that the structure, then the damage assessment, USAR would come through in the damage assessment, and we had some great assistance there from the local Indigenous rangers, where we couple up the local Indigenous rangers to our SES and urban search and rescue people doing the damage assessments. That damage assessment work then correlated to, the recovery payments. So it all interlinked, So it was really important work that was done. But by having the Indigenous rangers in the communities, we were able to then couple them with the responders, whether it be SES or Urban Search and Rescue, doing those assessments, giving us that intelligence, giving us that information, because we were obviously going into their community. So it was that link with the Indigenous rangers who were able to help us and assist us that. And there was some great work done. There was a DBCA officer who had some great experience, and then just this, we had this program, this Navigator program, morphed into being where we would utilise, again, the Indigenous rangers and more formalised it. So it really assisted us in that recovery process to go into the communities, determine what level of impact there was, so we'd record it, and then determine what work needed to be done so that we could then, clean it out. And then obviously if the structure's no longer viable, then it was deemed uninhabitable and written off.
Did you find there were times when you were thrown a curveball and you had to pivot from what you had intended to do? You know, maybe transport or, you know, impact through roads or...
Yeah, heaps of challenges. And you know, I remember a picture of the commissioner, and I think from memory the minister was up in Derby because we had some... the Derby shops were empty. There was significant impact to that road. I remember... police, you know, we had the police helicopter up there, and that combined it with the other intelligence that we were getting in. And I remember seeing the vision. You know, you asked me about the devastation earlier. Saw that vision of that air operations took through in the Wapol helicopter of the impact to the road. There was no way in the world that we were going to get trucks back on the road between Broome and Derby anytime soon. The level of damage to that road was huge. So, you know, I can remember having a conversation with the defence liaison, and again, you know, there was a lot of people who did a lot of great work on that, but you know, need to recognise the work that defence did. And I remember we had the challenge of not breaking the cold store link, so the food would come in on the trucks. You know, the frozen goods, the cold goods, and then we couldn't break that link. So how could we get that into a C-130 and fly it out to, you know, into Derby? Not breaking.
So was this in Broome?
Yeah, so the trucks would come into Broome, they'd load to the aircraft, and then, you know, it was an hour flight or something to Derby, but we couldn't break that cold chain link. And I can remember having a chat with the defence liaison, and he said, look, give me 24 hours. Now, it took him probably 36 hours to come up with a solution to get the cold stuff off the trucks into the plane and off at the other end, so it would go back into a cold truck to get. And next thing you know, we had vision, and I think the commissioner and the minister were up there, and you know, some very happy people in Derby because they had some food back on the shelves. And it was only by people working out those solutions, you know, and that's just one instance where we had to change tack, and you know, some people did some really good work, and so we could, you know, get food into Derby.
You saw hundreds of people displaced. The roads were damaged. Homes were damaged. I know that you're highly trained, obviously, in your role to respond to these types of incidents. Was there ever a moment when you thought, this is all too much?
Look, there were times I had to just stand aside and in my, you know, I'd close the door to my office or I'd find a quiet area where I'd just have to take stock and have a think, you know. Bearing in mind that, you know, you step out into, you know, you've got to lead a group of people. If people lose confidence in you, their performance starts to drop. So anything I did like that was certainly done in the privacy of my own office by myself. You know, now I've been with the organisation 20 years and been in the emergency management field as an SES Folly and the like for, you know, near on 35 now. So if I didn't have, you know, the benefit of, you know, being IC in Saroja and you know, Damien and all those other larger jobs, I certainly think I would have been found a bit more wanting than I was. But there was a job to do.
Did you find that your local knowledge helped? Oh,
absolutely. And I think that's why I stayed there, was able to stay there. Having that local knowledge, just knowing that, you know, there was, yes, we can use that airstrip. Yeah, there's an airstrip there. Well, how do you know there's an airstrip? Well, you've got that local knowledge. Going into communities, and, you know, we had a program prior to wet season every year, and we'd go out and, you know, I'd visit the ones in the Fitzroy Valley. The district officer in the East Kimberley would do his communities, et cetera, and every year you'd knock on the door and you know, check their level of preparedness, any change to their infrastructure, et cetera, and that's how you build up those relationships. And go into those communities, and you knew, you know, what the size of them, if they, you know, there were going to be any issues there, or there's a school there, or there's a shop here. Having all that local knowledge really, really helped me out.
You find in times of crisis, communities often band together. Is that something you witnessed?
Oh yeah, definitely, absolutely. From both the Fitzroy Crossing perspective, so from where I was, certainly people were rallying together, and that picture that I described earlier is a good example. And even to the point where the people, and yes, I did have a large team, but let me put it to you this way. And it sticks with me in my team and everyone getting in and doing the work. They dispatched up to assist, and I remember some senior marine rescue vols coming up to us, and I'm sure their normal role would be comms or whatever it would be, but they, what are they doing at a flood? Well, these people just got stuck in, and there were 70 people out of a small building, as I've said, and the issues that bring, and they made sure that the eskies were stocked and the bins they'd come in a couple of times a day, and we'd have meals and then the resultant rubbish that there would occur, and these people just got stuck in, and with no complaint, just got stuck in and got the job done.
So you feel like people were doing roles that weren't part of their usual role?
Because they had to.
Yeah.
That they were being asked to do things that they wouldn't normally been asked to do. And that was just a very small example of someone who, this is outside their realm of normal possibility, but who cares? Let's just get in and we can help in some way. And they did. And then it made running our team easier because, people, it was hot up there, and even though we're in an aircon building, but, people always had access to, cold drinks, in the esky. It was stocked every day. The bins were emptied, the food came in. We didn't have to think about things like that. It just happened. The COVID issues, people were managing that. So, just all got
Was your office or accommodation impacted at all?
Not the office, no. And the impact, let's put it this way, there were certainly issues in regards to supply, and bearing in mind that Broome at that time of year isn't, it's not the highest point of season, so not a lot of the shops that would normally be open. So we were relying on a lot of the same suppliers to make sure that they, would keep us fed, etc., and all the other things that we were needed. Bearing in mind we had, defence were there. The impact, I'd love to see what the impact of the airport was, because there was a lot more aircraft in the airport than there normally was. Just to give you an idea, the level of aircraft that were being used, once we could determine that the Fitzroy Crossing airstrip was safe, and the aerodrome manager, he had to check it all, and RFDS even, we're not flying in there because the floodwater had impacted right up to impacted about a third of the runway. And they said, look, because it's saturated. So we had to do a touch and go with a medium lift cargo aircraft from Defence. And then the aerodrome manager went out and put a level of wood in to see the indentation on the runway. And only after that we could bring aircraft in. And then the ADF had to bring in a mobile air traffic control, and was different for the locals because they weren't used to traffic control around Fitzroy Crossing. But there was that many aircraft coming in that Fitzroy Crossing Airport was meeting the same level of traffic, to about 75% of the traffic that were going to Perth Airport every day.
Wow.
Yeah, so just to, not only defence, but every health, the helicopters that we were using.
So was that for bringing things in, taking things out?
Yeah, correct.
Medical evacuations?
We would bring in responders every day because there wasn't any accommodation in Fitzroy Crossing. So they had to work during the day. We'd get them on an aircraft early. There were SES volunteers flying around a CH-47 Chinooks. I've never done that. So we'd fly them in and out every day. And then they'd come home and we would accommodate them in Broome, and then they'd go out again the next day. And we also had to manage the fatigue as well, because during the flood had long gone and then the humidity hit. So we were working them in the morning and the afternoon. We couldn't really work them during the middle of the day because it's just too hot.
How many days did this incident run for, actively, response phase?
Around 8 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, around 8 weeks.
Working in a disaster is obviously hard, but you must have seen some amazing and uplifting things.
Oh, yeah, definitely. just working, I won't any names, but there's a few people there. There's an air ops bloke that works for DFAS. My God, he hardest working man I've ever seen in my entire life. What the ADF did, the Urban Search and Rescue boys, what they were doing, the SES volunteers that went in there, and then the Fitzroy Crossing VFES. Everyone just got stuck in. There were photos going around of responders. Didn't matter what service they were from, but they were just covered in mud.
Exactly. Yeah. It was incredibly devastating, the situation at hand. But can you take anything positive away from it?
Yeah, definitely. The first thing is never underestimate. If you're going into a job, take the blinkers off. I remember going into that job thinking I'm only going to go to this, and it was way beyond that. So always expect the unexpected. It's certainly given me a lot more experience to assist me in any future events I might attend. I'm hoping that's the biggest of my career. I've got 10 years to go, so let's wait and see. Look, and the relationships that you build up over time, during the job, when people coming up and shaking your hand and saying thanks very much, and you're doing vice versa, and it's very gratifying.
Was it unlike anything you've ever seen before?
Once I got to I flew in with the Deputy Commissioner and I saw the bridge, and I'd seen, photos and stuff, and then I saw some of the homes, and it certainly gave me a new appreciation of the level of impact that an event like this can bring.
Glenn, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Are you looking for fast, accurate and official information that helps you to make informed decisions to stay safe during an emergency? The Department of Fire and Emergency Services Emergency WA app lets you set up watch zones for places important to you. So, if an emergency happens in your watch zone, you'll receive alerts and warnings. The best part? It's sent direct to your mobile device. Download DFAS's Emergency WA app from the App Store or Google Play today.
This is Mics and Sirens. I'm Silvana Politano. In the next episode, I sit down with the DFAS scientist. You might wonder what a scientist has to do with emergency services. Tune in to find out. For more information on this episode, visit the show notes.